Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jill McCluskey. I'm the chair of the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Welcome to our public session on adapting to climate change, managing water for agriculture. The purpose of this session is to gain insights on the state of knowledge of surface and groundwater availability for agriculture in the United States, the impact of climate change on water availability, and the shifts in agricultural practices, technologies, and locations in response to these changes. More generally, we are interested in water security for the sake of food security. We will have 3 panels this morning in this public session. In each panel, each speaker will present for about 10 minutes. After the presentations, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and discussions, which will be led by Jay Famiglietti, a member of the board and our moderator today. Jay is a hydrologist, a global futures professor at Arizona State University, and a science communicator. Our first panel is Water Policy for Agriculture. Our 3 speakers in this panel are Michael Hanneman, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and Arizona State University. Sarah Porter, who is the director of the Kill Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University, and Felicia Marcus, who is the William C. Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jay.
Thanks very much, Jill, and good morning, everyone. So Jill's explained the panels and the speakers. I'd just like to point out to the board and to our listeners that this is one of the reasons for having this workshop, and this is the second one we've done. One of the reasons for doing the workshop is to inform ourselves about the issues, bring in experts as we consider a longer study, perhaps a 2-year NASM study on water security for food security. This has been an interest of the board for a long time when Chuck Rice was chair, and we got going on it and we sort of dropped the ball a little bit, and now thankfully Jill has picked it up, and we really appreciate her leadership on that. I don't want to take up too much more time. Jill has explained all the speakers will give 10-minute presentations, and then we want to have a lot of conversation. And let's do that with a view towards some of these issues and towards what we might do in a longer study. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. Michael's already been introduced. I met Michael this year as I joined the ASU faculty, and he joined my class on global groundwater sustainability. And should have been given credit for a co-teacher. It was for co-teaching that, but really added a richness to our class conversation. So, Michael, over to you.
Can I share my slides? How does that?
Should be able to slide. You should be able to just share your screen, the green button.
It says disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, great. And let me, whoops. Okay, so it's a great honor and a pleasure to address you. I'm approaching this from the perspective of water more than agriculture. I've worked on water and agriculture, and particularly from the perspective of the Western states, including California. So from my perspective, the issue is water quantity, reduced quantity available. In general, that's controlled by individual states, not by the federal government. A key exception is the Colorado River. The lower Colorado River is managed by the federal government, and that plays a role in some of the Western states. Sarah, I think, will talk more about that. So from my perspective, when there's water shortage, basically the federal government's main role is to supply money and technical advice. But and there are federal water projects, but the state governments are in the driver's seat. And so when you talk to most people, they sort of assume that if there's a drought, at least in a short-run emergency, somebody is in charge. There's some mechanism for reducing water use and managing. That's a fallacy. So the key fact of water is its use, and control over its use is highly fragmented and highly decentralized. It's very different than electricity. Just a simple contract is, if you think of urban water use, there are 1,800 electric utilities in this country. There are well over 50,000 water utilities, just as an index of the fragmentation. Now, many people know about the distinctive Western water rights created originally in the early 1850s in California, appropriative water rights. And the key feature is that access to water goes with seniority, that is, with the earliest date in history when this water right was put to use. And so in theory, if there's not enough water in a river, the junior water rights take nothing, and the senior water rights get their full allotment. So it's a very unequal method of sharing. That's the theory. That's not how it works out in practice in most states, because the seniority is not self-enforcing. You need to have somebody monitoring water diversions, and you need to have some mechanism for cutting off the junior water users. So Colorado, which is at one extreme of competence in managing water rights, has both of those mechanisms. California is at the other extreme and has neither of those mechanisms. Very simply, California is with regard to water rights, California is the basket case of Western states. And other states are along a continuum, Colorado, Wyoming at one end, and other states more towards the California end. And now a key exception is where water rights, surface or groundwater rights, have been adjudicated, which is a legal process, which is very lengthy and very costly. And that has occurred in parts of some states, but not generally. That aside, where you don't have an adjudicated surface or groundwater basin, the appropriative rights system kicks in with varying degrees of sluggishness and incompleteness. And so the distinctive feature of water is nobody's in charge, no one person, no one agency, and most states don't have backup emergency plans for what they will do in a drought. We react to drought like we do when there's a flood. We rush in sandbags and the fire department comes in and people scramble. That's how we've done things. And with the increased frequency of drought in the West, that's not going to cut it. So I'm an economist, and if you wake up an economist from a deep sleep and ask her, what should you do to manage drought? She will say, price water and have water marketing. And both of those solutions are vastly oversimplified. Very briefly, economists focus on price as a signal of scarcity. In the real world, if you want to send a message to somebody, and that famous quote, they will say, send a telegram. Don't screw around with prices. Most people in most countries feel that price has to be based on cost, and artificially manipulating price when there's scarcity but costs haven't gone up is not legitimate. And there are also established administrative procedures for changing price. And so the notion that a drought comes along and you can raise the price of water 30% or whatever, which is assumed by most economists, doesn't work. With water markets, a key thing is to distinguish short-run exchanges, leases, versus long-run leases or permanent sales. Short-run exchanges, typically defined as less than 1 year or 2 years, work well. They work well because most states have relaxed their water rights code to facilitate short-term exchanges. And so short-term exchanges can readily be implemented. And those are very useful. A person that is short of water, a farmer can find some extra water. A farmer that has water that's he doesn't need or that it's better to sell can do that. But those are short-run exchanges. They're valuable, they're economically beneficial, they take place, but not on a vast scale. For one thing, during a drought emergency, there's not a lot of water available. And for another, the water that is available sells at high prices. Where short-run water leasing has played a valuable role is where urban agencies have acquired water in wet years and have enough storage to stockpile the water for use in a drought. The main example is Southern California's wholesale water agency, which started doing this about 15 years ago and did this very effectively. So we were hit by or became aware of drought in 2021 and 2022. And had the amazing rains not occurred, this was expected to continue for several more years. Southern California would have been okay because of the amount of water in storage. But if you don't have storage, short-term leasing isn't a long-run solution to drought. And if you do have storage, you need to exercise discipline in not emptying the storage too quickly. If we're thinking of long-run leasing or permanent sales, I mean, as you know, about 75–80% of the water in the West is used by agriculture. Cities are growing. In the long run, water needs to move some amount from agriculture to cities. What's widely overlooked is that the right to use water is highly differentiated. And a key distinction, which is not recognized, is the distinction between the property right, the appropriate right, versus the right to receive water from an irrigation district or from an urban agency. The permanent or long-run leases of the property right are hindered by legal requirements which create high transaction costs and slow the process down. The details vary from state to state, but that's true as a generalization. What is easy to do is moving water among two parties or member agencies served by the same water supply organization, wholesale or retail, different users served by the same irrigation district. And most of the water transfers that have occurred long run in California, particularly in Colorado, have taken place within the boundaries of one irrigation district or one water supply. That's worked well when the urban growth has occurred within the boundaries of the same water supply organization, say of an irrigation district. It doesn't work when the urban growth takes place outside. And so this image people have, there's a huge amount of water in agriculture and we need to transfer over time a small fraction. That's not how it works. There's not one big reservoir of water. There's lots of buckets, and each bucket has to be moved, has to be emptied. And as I say here, the obstacle to making things function more responsively and more speedily is existing water rights. And changing existing water rights is a political challenge that has been failed in most Western states. So this is my last slide. What I see as the key tools for managing water scarcity in agriculture and in urban water use, in surface water as well as in groundwater, is first of all, rigorously measuring water use at the level of individual water users, which in general we don't do. And secondly, not pricing, but managing the quantity. I see quantity controls as more important than price controls. They can be combined with price controls in tiered pricing. The first obstacle in many Western states is we have incomplete and inadequate records of existing water rights to surface water, even more so to groundwater. Australia, which made its major reforms in the last 25 years, one of the first, and in Australia, water rights are controlled by the individual states, not by the federal government, so it's like here. One of the crucial actions of the federal government was to offer a pot of money to the individual states to get their water rights records shipshape. And so let me say, if I were going to spend $3 billion on the 15 or 16 Western states, I would give them, an average of $500 million. I'd give them 5 years. And if they didn't get it done in time, I'd give them zip as an incentive. I think that's perhaps the most important thing the federal government could do that nobody's thinking about. Thank you. That's the end, and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Michael. I have so many takeaway nuggets from that that we can talk about during the discussion, but really, really an eye-opener. Also, thank you for keeping on time. Much appreciated. So we're going to turn it over to Sarah Porter now. Sarah, I don't know if you made it, but we're on, but everyone's already been introduced. But Sarah is the director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. She's a lawyer, and like Michael, Sarah, and even myself these days, really on the hot seat in Arizona with all the changes that are taking place so rapidly. So we're seeing Sarah's name in the media all the time. I'm surprised she can get any work done. So thanks so much for joining us, Sarah. Over to you.
Thank you. I thought I had this all figured out, my computer. All right. They wanted to.
So Sarah, our audio on you isn't really good, and love that you're on brand with your ASU Kyle Center Morrison Institute polo shirt.
All right. Thank you. Let me fix the audio. Is this better?
That's good. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I will share. Sorry for all of that. I really appreciate the chance to be here with you today, and I really feel honored to get to learn from my fellow panelists today. Let me start this slideshow. All right. So a brief introduction. The Kyle Center for Water Policy is part of Morrison Institute, a 40-year-old think tank at Arizona State University that basically does nonpartisan, fact-driven research and analysis on critical issues. Of course, we just focus on critical water issues in Arizona and the West. And I want to flag a tool that may be interesting for you to check out, not right now, but later. And that's the Arizona Water Blueprint. It's a big hub of all kinds of information about water in Arizona, including issues related to those that we'll talk about today, but it's very specifically Arizona. And one of the things you can find there is an explainer on the Colorado River shortage and particularly how it impacts Arizona, but it does have a lot of general information about how all of the 7 states in Mexico that share Colorado River water stand to be impacted by shortage. And so I'm going to talk about 2 things very briefly. The first, of course, is the Colorado River, just to sort of set the stage for what's going on. And then I'll drill down a little bit into what's going on with agriculture in Arizona. Much of what I'll say about Arizona can be generalized to other more water-challenged parts of the United States West. Of course, what's happening on the Colorado River, is that the 2 big reservoirs that hold the water for the lower basin, that would be California, Arizona, Southern Nevada, and Sonora, Mexico, those two reservoirs have been declining very persistently over the last 2 decades or so. And we are approaching a scary point in the reservoirs. We have been approaching, we got a little relief with this year's snow, but we've been approaching the scary points at which either there's no longer any hydropower production, or even more frightening by some measures, the point of dead pool where no water can be delivered off the reservoir. And this is really existentially a very frightening situation to be facing. Imagine no water flowing below Lake Powell through the Grand Canyon to get to Lake Mead, or no water flowing below Lake Mead to reach the agricultural areas like Imperial Valley or Yuma County that are responsible for the production of a lot of the vegetables that the nation eats in the wintertime, a lot of alfalfa that feeds the cattle for dairy and beef. It could be, and there are many tribes and other entities, communities that rely on this water. It's quite potentially catastrophic. And here in a nutshell, very, very general, is what the challenges are in the Colorado Basin. First of all, what we have to do to protect these reservoirs is to figure out ways of taking less water out of the reservoirs. I mean, the reason for the persistently lower levels in the reservoirs, the reasons are complicated. Certainly climate change is aridifying the Colorado Basin, and so we can expect less water flowing in the Colorado River year after year. But by the same token, the river has been over-allocated since the time of the Colorado Compact in 1922. We just didn't feel the over-allocation because water users hadn't figured out a way to get their water out and use it until the last couple of decades. So the only solution that we have control over, since we can't make it snow, is to reduce the amount of water we're taking out. And because agriculture is by far the major water user of water from the Colorado River, that we need to look to agriculture to participate in leaving water in the system. This is very, very difficult because agricultural water users tend to have the most high priority water rights. And so in times of shortage, it's those folks in the green pie wedge that should have all their water cut first before those senior folks in that big yellow piece of this pie. So that's the challenge. We are looking for ways of getting agriculture to leave water in the Colorado system that will work within the priority system. And that usually means different types of compensated conservation, different types of agreements between, for example, cities and agriculture, where municipal users who would benefit by not having cuts made according to priority could compensate or pay for efficiencies that would result in agricultural conservation. That is the fastest I've ever explained what's going on in the Colorado River. But again, this is very general, and there's much more that could be said about it. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about agriculture in Arizona. And I'll start with the fact that in Arizona, we have two different kinds of groundwater. We have groundwater that's highly regulated, and we've had a prohibition on new irrigated agriculture in the areas where groundwater is highly regulated. And then we have the rest of the state where groundwater is virtually unregulated. The only major rule about the use of, about the use of groundwater outside of the places where groundwater is regulated is that you cannot transport raw groundwater from basin to basin with limited exceptions, and that you can't waste it. So when we talk about agriculture in Arizona, we are talking about we're really talking about agriculture based on groundwater and agriculture based on Colorado River water. There's a limited amount of agriculture still using surface water that is not Colorado River water, but it's very, very limited. In spite of all of these, the troubles that Arizona has been facing related to groundwater and surface water, the number of irrigated agriculture acres in irrigated ag in Arizona has been pretty persistent over the decades. This is the last numbers from the 2017 Census of Agriculture, and it would go down a little bit now because some agriculture in central Arizona, some irrigated ag has decreased, but not too significantly. And here's kind of a breakdown, and I think this is what's important when we're thinking about agriculture in a place like Arizona, and I think there would be, in different places in the West, it would probably look similar. Almost all of the irrigated agriculture in Arizona occurs in 3 counties: Yuma, Maricopa, that's where Phoenix is, and Pinal County. Pinal County is the only agricultural region in Arizona where agriculture has experienced a cut in Colorado River supplies. So the figures would change a little, will change with the next census of agriculture. And this is what's being grown in Arizona. And this is I think worth drilling down into a little bit. So vegetables and melons are responsible for almost half of the cash proceeds from agriculture in Arizona, and yet they are a comparatively small amount of the irrigated acreage. Forage crops are responsible for a very significant amount of the irrigated acreage, and of course, forage crops are very comparatively high water use compared with vegetables. And yet they're responsible for a comparatively small fraction of the amount of revenue that agriculture realizes in the state of Arizona. In the state of Arizona, as in the greater Colorado Basin, agriculture is responsible for almost 3/4 of the consumptive use of water. And so that dynamic of cities looking at agriculture that Michael talked about, where cities are looking to agriculture and saying, look, you're not contributing much to the economy. We have these cities that are capable of contributing, greatly to the prosperity of people in the state. So we want some of your water. That dynamic is definitely playing out. And then by the same token, there's more and more awareness that many agricultural regions are turning to groundwater or have always been groundwater dependent. And that's really at this point, all of the agriculture in Arizona except agriculture along the main stem of the Colorado River, with a very limited amount of agriculture in Maricopa County that gets a little bit of surface water. And so there's more and more public awareness of the fact that what feels like lower value agriculture, I'm not accepting that characterization, but that is the characterization that is expressed very often, that it's using up the non-renewing groundwater resources that many people would rather stay in the aquifers as a future supply. Just another pitch for the blueprint, we have a farmland layer on the blueprint. And so you can go and actually pop up the farmland layer and see what's being grown. And what you see when you do that is that mostly alfalfa and cotton are being grown in these groundwater dependent areas. And a lot of alfalfa being grown, of course, along the main stem too. And another visualization from the Arizona Water Blueprint to show you that we really are experiencing in the state of Arizona the depletion of aquifers. This is our groundwater level changes out. I mean, hydrologically, we are observing the depletion of aquifers, particularly in rural areas, particularly because of a fairly recent influx of industrial scale agriculture, because those agricultural operations have realized that it's really easy to access groundwater in rural Arizona. And so there's more and more public consternation over the risk of having all of the rural aquifers dewatered. So what's in store? I'll speak particularly to Arizona. There are going to be, we've already seen fights over attempts by central Arizona to effectuate water transfers of the kind that Michael was describing, those complicated transfers, not easy market transactions, but where a city would acquire a water right from a Colorado River user on the main stem. We have the infrastructure in the form of the Central Arizona Project Canal that can move that water, already is moving Colorado River water from the western border where the river runs to Phoenix to Tucson. And there will continue to be pressure on agricultural water users along the western border to get that surface water for cities in Maricopa County and then down in Tucson in Pima County. And then there is increasing attention to the fact that industrial scale agriculture is present in Arizona and dewatering aquifers, putting local communities in peril, and very often exporting the product. And that leaves some people feeling that Arizona is giving away a precious resource without, not receiving a return. So that leaves me to conclude for you my thoughts about whether agriculture will continue to be sustainable or even continue in the Southwest. And I would say it really depends on the source of supply. We'll see continued pressure to reallocate renewable water supplies, and that would include surface water. And to the extent that they're used for agriculture, it includes effluent or reclaimed water. That pressure will grow, and in some cases, ag will give. And then finally, there are many concepts out there for water augmentation, from a desalination plant in Mexico to a pipeline from the Mississippi River, and many much smaller scale. None of those projects is likely to result in water supplies that are affordable for agriculture, unless, as one farmer told me, it's the last acre foot you need for your crop. But for the most part, I would say we can't look to augmentation as the United States did in the past as the water supply for agriculture. That's all I have. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was a fantastic overview. I'm looking forward to our discussion. One thing, if you could put the link to the Arizona Water Blueprint in the chat, or send it to Robin so other people can go and look at it. It's really, really a fantastic resource. And really appreciate all your insights. Now we're going to turn it over to Felicia Marcus. Again, our guests have been introduced, but most of us know Felicia as the former chair of the State Water Resources Control Board in California, especially during the really difficult times of drought, which haven't stopped, but during the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And now, so tell me if I get this right, Felicia, founding member of the Global Water Policy Group, which has an awesome collection of water leaders and thinkers. So let me turn it over to you, Felicia. Really curious about your thoughts after hearing from Michael and Sarah, and of course from your own experiences.
Well, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here with everyone. And why is my desktop saying it won't share my slides?
That's okay. That's okay. We get to see all your, that we're in the sports room.
We definitely are in the sports room. There we go. We're on the sports room, but I don't know why it's not sharing my slides. Let me just see if I can do that, because there's some good pictures here. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I'm pressing Zoom.
I see.
You can see me, but not my slides, right?
No, not yet.
Okay, my firewall's off. My follows off. I don't know. Well, that is the saddest thing ever. All right. So I guess I have to just talk, and I will send the slides later, and I'll give you a sense of what's out there. That's too bad. I really did enjoy it.
Just hang on just a second, Felicia. Do we already have
No.
Felicia's slides? If we don't,
No, because they were too
we don't
big
have.
to
Okay.
send. I think
no,
part
it's
of
all right.
part of the challenge is just that I have.
I think it rights to share. You have rights to share, right?
No, I do. I think the problem is really just that I am using my travel computer, and it's an old computer. Okay, sorry. I will I'll get them. I'll find a way to get them maybe later today. Sorry about that. I'm delighted to be on this panel with everybody, though, not just the panel of speakers on policy here, but also the speakers on your subsequent panels. I think you've done a phenomenal job of bringing in some of the most thoughtful people I know, obviously starting with Jay, but you know, you've got a host of great people behind me who can fill in on some of the details. What I thought I would do is give you a bit of food for thought. I'm going to go through my slides where I'll see them and you won't. This is an interesting challenge. To talk a little bit of food for thought about how climate change is going to affect agriculture in California. And then I wanted to highlight a few of the policy lenses and policies that have come to deal with these issues. And those are the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that Jay referenced, managed aquifer recharge as an answer to that, which is kind of on speed, and a lot of great experimental work is going on. Multi-benefit land repurposing, which is a policy measure in California to try and help farmers transition, especially those on marginal lands, a voluntary program, but one that involves funding. But as with managed aquifer recharge, is creating some alliances of unlikely allies to really try and do things a little bit differently. I want to talk a little bit about the irrigated lands regulatory program. And while you may think that the water quality aspect of regulation isn't as much related to quantity, it really is, because of the pressures, particularly between urban, not just small communities, but larger urban communities who are finding their water supplies contaminated, not by evil polluters, but as the externality and byproduct of decades of totally legitimate food production, which have dumped more nitrogen, for example, onto crops and contaminated groundwater that then communities find themselves faced with, which in many places is causing a lot of pressure, political pressure, and others on agriculture. And then a little bit, a few other thoughts looking towards the future. What you'll find when you see these slides, I've put a lot of things together quickly just to give you some resources as you think about what you're going to be doing off into the future. And they're all things that we can talk about a lot more. One that you will find is what I made a laminated wallet card of the key aspects of California water that most people don't know. I mean, again, as people talk about water, it tends to be in sound bites. That's all one thing or another. Some other stakeholder is evil. Some idiots up north are making mistakes. Some idiots down south are taking too much water. It's all this or that. It's all storage and conveyance. It's all we can recycle and conserve our way to the future. And the answer is they're all wrong, that we are facing a collective challenge. We always have, but it's going to get worse under climate change. And that in facing this speeding freight train of pain coming at us all, we have to actually do a lot. And so what the slide says is it just talks about some of the aspects of California water, which are not unique to the West, but it's sort of more so. So we have the most variable hydrology of wet and dry, either year to year, location to location, time of season within a year. We have this very variable set of water rights that follow on what Michael talked about. We have groundwater in some places, we don't in others. And so how a particular area or even a particular farm fares depends on how senior their water rights are, how reliable the surface water, and what the depth or the reliability of their groundwater is. And this totally varies. So as a result, over half of our population lives hundreds of miles from where their imported water comes from. Some of them have no idea where it comes from, which is a miracle of modern civilization, that so many cannot have to worry about where their water comes from. But it becomes challenging in times of drought when you need people to conserve. And like we did fairly well during a drought of the mid-teens and getting urban Californians to save virtually 25% of their water through a lot of campaigning and some mandatory rules, which has been much celebrated. And in ag, perhaps less so, but in part in California, similar to what Sarah was talking about, we have one of those Mediterranean climates that can grow an incredible amount of healthy fruits and vegetables that the state, the nation, in fact, parts of the world rely on. And so it's of great value. So you'll see on this card a little bit of the key issues. You'll see some slides that support that. And I'm going to move on along, and you'll see a slide that has the very extensive system of public works that make modern California possible. Individual aqueducts, in particular, looking at the Colorado River, which supplies 25 to 30% of Southern California's imported water, the aqueducts on the eastern and the western side of the Sierras, the western side flowing through the Bay Delta system, which is the source of a lot of our conflict that we don't have time to talk about. Another 30% for Southern California, much higher percentage for, well, not much higher, but a similar percentage from for agriculture in the Central Valley. Again, very essential, but vulnerable to disruption, both from the droughts we're going to see and from earthquakes in some cases and the like. And you see Southern California urban diversifying as quickly as possible, adding the 2 largest recycling projects in the world on top of Orange County, and working on a massive $300 million a year stormwater capture, multi-benefit stormwater capture project in LA County. They've gotten the message, as well as being very good on conservation. But what we will see in California is more extremes, from drought to floods. Have some great charts that you will find about what it looked like, and you see this boom and bust, where one year we have reservoirs and pictures of them running dry, and the next one you have Oroville about to be overtopped. And certainly this year we see Tulare Lake reemerging, that was once the largest lake west of the Mississippi, totally dewatered basin, and now refilling. It may take 2 years for it to seep. So we have to deal with this boom and bust, both of which can hurt agriculture mightily. The Colorado, which Sarah ably talked about as an issue, and then with climate change, perhaps the biggest thing that we're facing is our loss of snowpack. Same is true on the Colorado, where fully 30% of the storage in an average year is in snowpack, and with a few degrees Fahrenheit temperature rise, we are going to lose much or all of it over the course of the next 50 to 100 years, which makes all of the conflicts in the Western water war seem like a picnic compared to what we're all going to face, which is why we need to work more quickly to deal with this, and more collaboratively across divides, and more creatively in terms of the policies that we employ. It's also compounded by the groundwater overdraft that Sarah talked about in California. Jay did some remarkable work with NASA and the GRACE satellites that gave some visuals that were very, very clear to the public about the extent of overdraft in the Central Valley. In particular, I give those pictures a lot of credit for the fact that we were able to pass historic groundwater management legislation. It took us 100 years to get some after the passage of the surface water rules, such as they are, as fragmented and basket case and deplorable as Michael mentioned. That made me laugh out loud. I didn't have my sound on, but you would have heard me cackling. But it's true. And those pictures, combined with the other thing Sarah mentioned, which is the moving in of outside investors and others seeking to liquidate an essentially free asset, also led, I think, to the political force that allowed us to get SGMA passed. You'll also see another wallet card, which is this all of the above approach of the Brown administration, which put everything from conservation and integrated water management, safe drinking water for communities, managing for floods and droughts, groundwater management, all of that in one quick place, which yielded a political softening where people could see their one issue in there, and so they could live with other people's issue, which changed the dynamic and allowed us to get moving on a whole host of policies that we needed to deal with climate change. All right. Let me talk a little bit about those three measures, and you'll see in the slides more detail, and I'm happy to follow up with any of you. And I think some of my colleagues from California will talk about these in more detail in the next panel. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has a few features. It's different, and I think it's interesting from a policy option. The framing is more about collective implementation and adaptive governance, where the responsibility is on the local agency to come up with a plan to get to sustainability within 20 years. That doesn't mean a balloon payment in 20 years. That means a plan that's viable within 5 years, depending on whether you're high or medium. If people get there, great. If they don't, the Department of Water Resources acts as the umpire calling balls and strikes. We've had a few rounds of that with some challenges, of course. This is a difficult thing. And then the State Water Board, which I used to lead as the bad cop or 800-pound gorilla, that if you don't get it done, we put you on probation, we make you report your pumping, which people hate. And ultimately, if you can't cure, you end up with the water board doing a plan so that somebody will, and nobody wants that. And there are a series of undesirable results that you have to meet. Many of the early plans didn't meet it. Many of them got better as they cured in a couple of rounds, and 6 have been forwarded to the water board now. So it's still going well. You've had a huge response, over 90% compliance, at least with the initial deadlines, which was really great. And folks have put their energy, most importantly, into dealing with this problem with their peers on the ground, as opposed to just fighting with Sacramento. In managed aquifer recharge, there is a sort of a renaissance of folks trying to figure out how to do this, both through, I'll give you 2 examples, through flooding hitherto thought of as non-floodable crops for recharge, permanent crops like trees and vines. Don Cameron at Terra Nova Farms is a pioneer in that, and Jay Lund and Thomas Harder's colleague Helen Dahlke has been helping on that. Another is figuring out how to find the best places for recharge using overflights and airborne electromagnetic surveys that my colleague at Stanford, Rosemary Knight, has done a lot. And you'll see some great visuals going, and DWR is now actually doing overflights of virtually the whole Central Valley, but all of the high and medium risk basins, so people can target the exact place to put things in. There's also a lot of amazing work going on in what's known as multi-benefit land repurposing. The Public Policy Institute of California estimates 500,000 to 1 million or more acres of farmland are going to have to go out of production in order for agriculture in the Central Valley to live within its means. There's still going to be plenty of agriculture, but it's going to be a painful shift. And this is a way to make it easier, either to use it for solar, use it for lower water use crops, use it for habitat. And in both the managed aquifer recharge and repurposing, you have some amazing work with environmental groups and local communities working together with farmers to make this happen. Then finally, I'll just put a flag on, sorry, I've gone long. I'll put a flag on Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, and a shout out to Thomas Harder, who did some really critical studies for the state in 2012. And we did a report in 2013 that kind of outed California for how many people were relying in whole or in part on contaminated groundwater, largely from legacy nitrogen application. And this is not unique to California, although we intentionally tried to get a lot of media attention for this. Is true anywhere there's been irrigated agriculture. It's just there are a few states that have sort of outed themselves on this and are taking action. Why is this important to the future of agriculture? Because there's a lot of political pressure, as I mentioned, from not just small communities, but larger communities. There was litigation in Iowa from the urban front against some of the irrigation districts. You're going to see this more and more because it costs a lot to treat, but a big measure. And in that case, in irrigated lands, we also use this notion of collective implementation, knowing the regulated entities and how they were neighborly and worked together, and how they hated giving information to government, where they collectively have to map and get all the data of water in the soil, nitrogen remaining in the soil, nitrogen in the water applied, nitrogen taken out, and actually get to see that. And the theory is that by making that transparent within these coalitions that have formed, that farmers talking to farmers will get us a faster drop in nitrogen application, so they can then pump and fertilize their way to cleaning up these basins at the same time as folks are focused on testing drinking water wells. And there's a lot in there, but a very creative thing that we're going to have some data soon about. And then finally, in closing, I just wanted to flag a couple of exciting bigger picture things which have to deal with floodplain setbacks and some exciting work happening, not just in things like the Yolo bypass outside Sacramento, which frankly, if all of the work had not been done to do these setbacks and flood easements, Sacramento would have flooded during a couple of our big storms, a new project, Dos Rios, with river partners and a whole host of players. And then, of course, a whole lot on precision agriculture, more efficient use and use of water recycling. So there's a menu for you. And sorry about the slides.
Thanks so much, Felicia, for that incredible overview and for your insights. I want to check with my co-organizers here, Jill and Robin, in terms of how much time you think we should allow for a little bit of discussion, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then move on to our next panel.
15 minutes.
Okay, so also it's not clear, Robin, are we taking questions from outside of the committee?
So there is for people watching on the web, there is a Slido link so that they can submit questions if they'd like to. And so really it's the board and
okay,
and any questions that you'd like to offer from the
sure. Okay, so let's start by, first of all, thanking all three speakers for a rapid but actually a quite comprehensive review of the issues, mostly in the southwestern United States, but certainly applicable all over the place. I get to talk to these folks all the time, so I would like to see if there's any questions from the board. And I don't know how we're doing that. We're just going to raise hands, or because I can't see anybody except my own giant head right here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any hands raised, but the members of the board can unmute themselves if they want to.
And if we don't have questions from the board, are there questions from the public that we want to take? Let's give the board members 15 more seconds to wake up.
I'm awake.
All right. Go ahead.
I was being
Go ahead. Go ahead, Douglas.
So Doug Jackson Smith from Ohio State, but somebody who's moved here from the West and knows a lot about Western water. I was curious about the state of politics right now vis-a-vis agriculture's positioning in the political discussions. I worked in Utah for a number of years, and agriculture didn't need to come to the table. There wasn't the crisis moment yet, like we're beginning to see more recently. But I would give them advice that now is the time to come to the table when you have public support and great empathy and interest in preserving traditional agriculture and the agricultural industry. The crisis I've watched from afar with the Colorado River the last couple of years seemed to me to perhaps be a game changer. And I'm just wondering how you see that unfolding in California and Arizona. Traditionally, agriculture's role in these conversations is tremendously, important. But is there a more nuanced conversation vis-a-vis issues like in Arizona, the debate between, especially crop production and forage production, that begin to open up opportunities to think or rethink how agriculture fits into water rights, how agriculture fits into water policy?
Sarah, you want to jump on that first, and then maybe Felicia?
Sure. I agree that what felt like an extremely urgent situation 1 year ago, when we were really staring at the possibility of Deadpool within a year, that did spark some interesting conversations. Agriculture, particularly in Yuma County, but also to some degree in Imperial County. The two, Imperial is the biggest Colorado River water user, rights holder, of anyone, with 3.1 million acre feet per year of California's 4.4 million acre feet. But those farmers in those regions expressed an interest in compensated conservation. And that was different from before. The price tag that they attached to it was too high to be feasible, but it was really, I think, reflective of a changing in attitude. And I've seen, you know, it's just these little things. No one's stepping up and saying, oh, okay, we'll give up some water, you know, but they understood. The Yuma group called themselves the Save the Water, Save Our River Coalition. So they understood that this was existential for them. And more recently, there's a big pitched battle in Western Arizona over the transfer of a fairly small main stem water right held by a private farm. And it's been interesting to me to see that the big agricultural irrigation districts in Yuma have not joined in the lawsuit. I take that as a sign that they don't want to position themselves as not being willing to talk about future opportunities in which there are ways they can figure out to grow what they're growing and make as much money as they're currently making with less water, if there is some kind of participation or compensation coming from the people who would benefit from that, meaning in the case of Arizona, cities in central Arizona. As far as the conversation about forage crops and groundwater goes, you know, most of the central Arizona farmers are really not sure they're going to be here. And they're just basically farming until they can't farm anymore, either because the land is repurposed or because the water is too expensive, because it's expensive to pump groundwater. And so I don't see the kind of conversation about switching to a non-forage crop that you would need to have, where you, okay, let's build refrigeration houses, let's make sure we have the transportation infrastructure, we need a migrant worker, probably labor force, things, you know, those kinds of investments are probably not going to happen. Out on the main stem, it's a little different, but it won't, you know, again, what's really critical there is money, willing partnerships, and technology that allows for the production, at least at its current economic levels.
That was great. Well, building on that, I'll just, in the time we have, I'll just mention two thoughts on your very big question. There's actually a lot in there. And some of it will come from my being more of the, I'll call myself the expert generalist or the political person historically on the panel. I think this issue of buying water and the economics of it that both Sarah and Michael have talked about is really important. And what you have is you have sort of the public talking points about them, which is very anti what's known as buy and dry, which is the idea of folks coming in from not from around here and buying land or water for the purpose primarily ultimately of selling it to urbans. One of my friends in Arizona referred to this as water laundering rather than money laundering, as a way to essentially transfer water to urbans without the urbans having to take the heat in the front end of buying from agricultural areas. I think over time that is going to happen just because of the economics of this, and hopefully in a way that doesn't destroy local communities. Because if you think about some of Imperial's hesitation in just even selling their water, there's a complicating factor of the fact that the Salton Sea is fed fully from, almost fully, there's the New River and one other river, the name of which is escaping me, that are smaller, but most of the water that goes into the Salton Sea is ag return flow from Imperial. And as Imperial, due to the Quantification Settlement Act, is sending more water, selling more water to San Diego, the lake is receding faster. The state is finally stepping up to mitigation obligations that it took on 20 years ago, but not fast enough. And so if you're asking Imperial to sell more of their water or give it up, you're also asking them to poison the air of their own communities. And so it's complicating. And fortunately, there was money in the Inflation Reduction Act that was towards ecological restoration. 250 million will go to the Salton Sea, which gives the farmers in Imperial a little more comfort to be able to sell their water at whatever cost. The other dynamic that I'm seeing, again, below the radar, not as much in the media, where the fighting words are more clear, between, say, the environmental community and the agricultural community, or between farmers and other farmers, is these coalitions that I mentioned very quickly coming together to find managed aquifer recharge sites that also can be ecologically beneficial, and the land repurposing grants, which have a lot of support and were really supported by the many members of the environmental community to try and help farmers make this transition in ways that are beneficial to the environment at the same time. And so on the ground, I'm seeing very encouraging signs, as well as enabling work from the agencies and the legislature, but still really a long way to go in the broader talking point dynamic, where, you know, if you ask people about me, I'm either an eco-terrorist, an ag apologist, or a metropolitan handmaiden, and you can't be all three of those. And so my whole career has been being a bridge builder between those groups, much to my dismay, because the only way we really move forward is to figure out how to move forward together. So I'm hoping more leaders like the ones I'm seeing emerge in the Central Valley, which includes the courage of agricultural users to talk about this transition more openly, get the support they deserve. But that's where we have to go.
Thanks so much, folks. Robin, do we have any questions from our outside listeners?
We have several questions.
Let's take one, and I'll just leave it up to you if you don't mind.
Okay.
Because I don't see them.
I see. Well, so there are a couple questions related to what the Farm Bill can do to incentivize farmer shifts to different, less water intensive crops, and but one from my colleague, I'll give her, is this. She says managed aquifer storage seems like a priority in California, given the extremes in wet and dry times. But what are the barriers to doing this? What are the major impediments to expanding managed aquifer storage?
So do we have any volunteers to speak on this?
Well, I would say there's a lot going on right now. I mean, part of it is the technology that Rosemary and others have promoted, is to figure out where to put it in and where to take it out. It's like an ant farm. You have a diagram from one of Rosemary's slide underground, but in 3D, where, you need to find the best place to put it in and the best place to take it out, which may not be near each other. In California, with our geology, it's all fractured and bumpy and layered. Other places, have flatter, but, we don't have the Ogallala, for example, aquifer that spans multiple states. We've got little pockets of it in all these different places. And the next panel, I think, can talk about this in more depth, no pun intended. We have to actually figure out the technology to figure that out, and that's there, and it's being mapped. Finding paleo valleys, which Jay Lund and Thomas's colleague Graham Fogg has been working on for years, where we think there are these very deep, good places to be able to store a lot. And we need to do it as fast as we can, because those groundwater basins are the only thing that can make up for the loss of snowpack we're going to have. We've already dammed all the best sites, and there are pocket storage that we need to have all over the place. But groundwater basins are definitely the winner. That's one thing. And the other is these collaborations where you end up with grant funding like the Multipurpose Act. And it also helps fund these different regional agencies work with farmers and nonprofits to come up with these projects that are really great. So more money there would really be helpful. The governor asked for 10 times as much as he got, and I'm hoping the success of it leads to more money down the line.
Maybe I'll just, go ahead, Michael.
We also have to manage the extraction of the groundwater that has been recharged. And Sigma is a framework for doing that, but Sigma, will kick in over a couple of decades. So we have to make sure it's not stolen. in the meanwhile?
So I just want to, so maybe to close this session and to move on to the next one, I just want to add that in addition to what Felicia is talking about and what Michael just mentioned about the extraction, what Felicia was talking about finding the right places, doing the mapping of the places that have the high transmissivity you need to get the water in and out. There's the actual challenge of getting the water, from where it is to those places, and it's not, it's not easy. We're talking about episodic recharge during intense rainfalls, and El Nino coming up. We're talking about the intermittent but sometimes incredibly wet winters, like the one that we just had. And it's not, it's just, the snow is over here, and maybe the recharge location is over here. We may or may not own that property, and we may or may not have the ability to move the water from one place to the other. So there's a lot of need on that side as well, to figure out the technology to deal with, maybe it's temporary storage. I don't even know. I don't know the answer, but to capitalize on this, these intermittent periods of these very intermittent but very important wet periods, because it's that periodic recharge in terms of groundwater that is becoming incredibly important, and we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet.
Well, it's very exciting. If you look at some of the proposals under the land repurposing, it'd be like, this is what I was predicting when we did Sigma, where you'll end up with Farmer Joe farming water molecules instead of crops, where he's got the right, or she's got the right spot. That land gets set aside to capture a boatload of water when it comes in. And so, and there's also, I didn't get into it, a lot of water rights emergency measures and other things going on to allow people to capture that water, because now people are fighting over the flood flows where they used to fight over regular flows. So it's a lot of legal stuff.
I always go back to the first Star Wars movie, which I don't actually know, where it is in the sequence, but opening scenes, or the moisture farm, right? The moisture farmer.
That's right.
Okay, I think that we are now, so thank you very much. This first panel, really, really appreciate it. We're now going to move to our second panel, which is a little bit more on groundwater monitoring and scarcity, and looking more at the sort of quantity side of things. And since we are running a little bit behind, we have 4 speakers in this session. I'll just introduce the speakers briefly, and then ask them, because we've moved away from Jill's introduction at the beginning of our session, maybe ask each speaker to just give a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of what they do. I'll just sort of say who you are. So we've got Deb Perrone, who's at UC Santa Barbara, Jay Lund, who's at Davis, Thomas Harder, who's at Davis, and Josh Fierce, who's at UC Merced. And let's turn it over to Deb. And to all the speakers, thank you so much for making time to spend with us this morning.
Thanks for that introduction, Jay. Today, I'm going to be talking about quantifying the impact of declining groundwater levels on agriculture across the United States. So what do we know? Well, we know that in many parts of the United States, agriculture relies on irrigation. This map here shows the extent of land area equipped for irrigation. The green areas show rain-fed areas, and the blue areas are areas that rely heavily on irrigation in varied extents. Those of you familiar with groundwater likely notice that many of the blue areas look remarkably similar to our aquifers and our aquifer systems. The black outlines that I'm showing here are from a new data product that we produced that delineates components of aquifers based on their local hydrogeology. This map shows areas heavily serviced by groundwater in dark blue and black. So given the connection between the location of our aquifers and the heavy reliance on irrigation, it's not surprising that many of the areas that rely heavily on groundwater for irrigation are the same areas that we saw in the previous in the previous maps. So the big take home here is that agriculture relies on groundwater withdrawals. Unfortunately, this reliance on groundwater is leading to undesirable results, like the chronic lowering of groundwater levels across many of the country's agricultural hubs, not just places in the Western United States like Arizona and California. One impact of declining groundwater levels that we recently quantified is wells running dry. A well runs dry when water levels decline so significantly that it's no longer possible to pump water to the surface. This affects the ability of a person to access water. Our works estimated that up to 1 in 5 groundwater wells are at risk of running dry should groundwater levels decline by only a few meters. For context, this map here shows 11.8 million groundwater wells constructed between 1950 and 2015. So when we say that 1 in 5 groundwater wells are at risk of running dry, we're talking about more than 1 million groundwater wells across the country that are at risk of running dry if groundwater levels decline by just a few meters. Importantly, before this work, we didn't have an understanding across the United States at a continental scale where groundwater wells were located, let alone who was at risk of having their well run dry. Now, not all of these groundwater wells are for agricultural purposes. Actually, the majority of groundwater wells in the United States are for domestic and municipal purposes. Only 15% of groundwater wells are for irrigated agriculture. The remaining areas here shown in red include 2% for industrial purposes. Nevertheless, wells that are at risk of running dry tend to be clustered in rural areas, like parts of the Central Valley and the High Plains, both areas that are heavily reliant on agriculture. In the last panel, we heard a bit about California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, also known as SGMA. SGMA gives discretion to local agencies to set their sustainability goals. And these sustainability goals could protect rural landowners from declining groundwater levels. A critical component of doing so is setting management thresholds. Here you can see that dashed yellow line on the slide. So for example, based on that proposed threshold shown here, the well on the left is not protected. The reason for this is because the bottom of the well is above that threshold. But the well on the right, it is protected. And the reason for this is because its well bottom is below the threshold. We currently have a paper in press that's reviewed 108 groundwater sustainability plans under SGMA. As part of our analysis, we found that the majority of plans do not set their water level thresholds to protect users. In fact, we found that only 40% of agricultural wells are protected by the management thresholds that are set out by the respective sustainability plans. That leaves more than half unprotected. Of course, this raises questions about how agriculture will adapt to declining groundwater levels. So one way that we've seen agricultural users adapt is to construct deeper wells. This map here shows the rank correlations of well depth versus time. So what we see is that the gray areas have little to no trend. The blue areas show places where newer wells are shallower than older wells. And the orange and red areas are places where newer wells are deeper than older wells. Now, generally, we see that in places like California's Central Valley, newer wells are deeper than older wells. However, in other places where groundwater levels are declining and agriculture is prominent, like parts of the southern High Plains, newer wells are not necessarily deeper than older wells. Importantly, prior to this map, we didn't have a good understanding of well construction patterns across the United States. And this is really important to understand how people are adapting to declining groundwater levels. Understanding continental scale patterns is also important if we want to connect quantity with quality. So we know that in some places, folks are drilling deeper wells, and this could provide a stopgap to groundwater depletion. Constructing a deeper well to avoid depletion does not mean that you're in the clear, though. And this is really important when we start to connect quantity to quality. In a recent assessment of the depth to brackish or salty water, we found that in basins across the United States, the transition from fresh to salty water is actually shallower than we previously thought. What does this mean? This means that we have less fresh water than we previously thought we had. Now, in a follow-on study, we actually found that 24% of California's agricultural wells were within just 200 meters of this transition zone or deeper than the transition zone. Now, it's really important to recognize that just because people are accessing brackish or salty water doesn't mean that this water is unusable. But for agricultural purposes, what this could mean is that costs are going to increase. Acquisition costs, treatment costs can increase as we try to desalinate that water. Additionally, heavy pumping in fresh to brackish transition zones can influence the salty gradients for the worse. So basically, that means that we could migrate those brackish waters to shallower depths. So basically, in sum, accessing groundwater for agriculture can be threatened not only by depletion, but also by the quality of our deep groundwater. So the last of the studies that I'll focus on today is about the link of groundwater to surface water. So in most places, when we pump groundwater, we're not in a black box. We're not just affecting groundwater. Typically, in places that receive rainfall and do not have groundwater overuse, groundwater flows from the aquifer to the stream. However, overpumping can change the gradient so that the stream water now flows into the aquifer. This is called a losing stream, and this has implications for agricultural areas that rely on surface water resources. We use continental scale datasets to estimate the hydraulic gradient between aquifers and nearby streams to better understand where we have gaining and where we have losing streams. This map here shows river segments across the United States. And this map shows our estimated gradient patterns. The blue areas are segments where most of the groundwater levels are above the stream surface. So basically, these are areas indicative of a gaining stream. The red segments are areas where groundwater levels lie below the stream surface. This is indicative of a losing stream. Across the United States, we find that 2/3 of segments represent losing streams. We typically see these hydraulic gradients indicative of losing streams in areas known to have long-term groundwater depletion, like California's Central Valley and like portions of the Southern High Plains. But we also see hydraulic gradients indicative of losing streams in areas that are not widely considered or widely highlighted as groundwater depletion hotspots, like Eastern Washington and near the Great Lakes. Both places are agricultural hotspots. So what do we know? Well, we know that groundwater is important to irrigation. We know that groundwater levels are declining across the United States and wells are running dry. In fact, 1 in 5 wells are at risk of running dry should groundwater levels decline by just a few meters. We also know that in California, a hub for agriculture and groundwater depletion, new management plans only protect some wells from running dry. Drilling deeper may not be the solution, and drilling deeper is actually not ubiquitous in all places where we see groundwater levels are declining. Also, drilling deeper is not the final solution because there's also water quality concerns that we need to think about. And finally, we know that pumping groundwater affects surface water resources in key agricultural regions across the United States. Fundamentally, this work that I presented today focuses on the continental scale patterns, and these continental scale patterns are critical for us to understand both the direct and the indirect impacts of groundwater overuse on agriculture in the US. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deb. If you've been following Deb's work like I have, she's doing an excellent job of, very deliberately tackling these difficult questions and showing us exactly what many of us sort of like myself, hey, wells are running dry and the quality is going down. And so Deb and in collaboration with Scott Giuseco, have really just been doing some incredible work on this. So thanks so much, Deb, for joining us. Jay, I see you there, and we're going to turn it over to you. If you could do me a favor and just give us a 1 or 2 sentence reminder of your background, and then go into your presentation. Thanks, Deb, and over to you, Jay.
I thought I was going last.
I'm just reading off of a list here that has.
Okay,
Deb,
well, I can go now. It's okay.
You're up, man. You're a pro. You've got this.
Not a problem. I'm not going to have any slides. I'm just going to talk. Water in Western agriculture, mostly in the West, is always a challenge. I'm here on the East Coast now, looking outside, just down the street from where Joe Biden has his Delaware house. We just had a huge thunderstorm. We have irrigation here that is provided by solar desalinated seawater most of the time, meaning water evaporates off the ocean and it falls on top of things with precipitation. For those of you from the West that aren't familiar with it. There are places such as the southern part of Delaware that have quite a bit of supplemental irrigation from groundwater, as was pointed out. And I was also glad to see that the previous speaker pointed out that this supplemental irrigation also is supplied mostly from streams, nearby streams. So we actually have surface water depletion caused by groundwater use, right? So rather than having perpetual overdraft like we have in the West from such irrigation, we have water being pulled from streams where the streams are more abundant. In terms of water sources, we have 2 major sources of water for agriculture: it's groundwater and surface water, as you all know. Surface water is seeing some reductions in its availability for a couple of reasons. Certainly in California, at least, from climate change, and I think in the wider West from climate change and the warmer climates, which are reducing the availability of surface water. So it evaporates off of the landscape before it gets into the surface water. Groundwater is also suffering from reductions, partly because we've been overusing it. So in the entire West, pretty much any time you have a reduction in surface water supplies, people go out back, turn on the pumps. And so what we have is, in some places, like in Arizona, we have just perpetually mining of groundwater to supply agriculture and towns and household use. But in the Central Valley of California, we tend to have sort of a stair-stepping of groundwater depletion, mostly during drought years. In addition to that, we have declining groundwater quality. Most of the world that has modern agriculture, which is nitrogen enriched, is seeing nitrate contamination of groundwater. And Thomas, I'm sure, will talk more about this. So we have several major sources of groundwater quality that interfere with urban uses, domestic uses, as well as agriculture. Nitrogen contamination is probably the most widespread, and then as this previous speaker pointed out, salinity as well. The demands that this water is being put to are a couple of are manifest in urban use. Fortunately, per capita urban use is going down in most of this country, which is really taking a lot of pressure off the urban water systems. We have some areas such as Arizona where people are still moving to and want to have lawns and water use out in new areas. So we have some areas with increasing urban water use, but most of the areas have declining urban use. And the urban areas are pretty well off as well, in that they have a lot of political resources that are pretty well organized, and they're usually relatively rich, because urban areas is where the predominance of the economy is. Agriculture, as has been mentioned, is 70 to 80% of human water use in the West. It's mostly for crops that are global commodities, so it's actually not a huge proportion of these crops, except for the specialty crops in California and in the fruits and vegetables in the Yuma area of Arizona. And it's less than 5%, maybe 3 or 4% of the state's economies in most Western states. That makes it easy to make some of the transitions that are going to be needed, but there will be some local areas that are heavily impacted when we get to reducing that urban water, or reducing the agricultural water use, which is about the only direction we can go for most of the shortages that we have, imbalance that we have between supplies and demands. Environmental water use is sort of the third major water use. We're seeing growth in demands for and regulatory demands for environmental water use, both to keep streams watered for surface water and not being undermined with groundwater pumping. Environmental water uses are also very vulnerable to climate change, and they're probably the least effectively organized for undergoing the huge changes that they're going to have to see and deal with climate change and just the general dynamics of Western water. We have a few solutions that are available. Most of the solutions that are effective are not the ones that we talk about. There's always a lot of talk in the West about adding new surface storage and adding conveyance and new desalinization plants and urban wastewater reuse. We're not going to get hardly anything out of those. There'll be a few places, because the West is a very large, diverse place, where some of those will be useful. But in terms of the gross water imbalances that we have in the West, those are going to be very small potatoes, vanishingly small. There's a lot of concern and thought and work being done on managed aquifer recharge, expanding groundwater infiltration, particularly during wet times. This is going to be helpful, but in the parts of California that we've looked at it, you might get 15 or 20% of our groundwater imbalance supplied by this kind of enhanced recharge. But the overwhelming amount of way that we have to address this imbalance between groundwater and surface water and demands is by reducing agricultural use. And that is not going to be by efficiencies in most places. It will be by fallowing. And that's got to be brutal for those local areas. But there's really no way around it. These actions will be mostly local. Almost all water management is really local in the West. It'll fall in a context of state water rights and maybe state establishment of principles that will guide some water markets, make those easier. It'll exist in a set of incentives and maybe a little bit of money and maybe some federal project management that will help this along. And certainly in the Colorado River Basin, that's going to be it. But the private sector and the agricultural sector is mostly going to be reacting to reductions in water availability, increases in water price, and water regulations over time. If we manage these changes correctly, manage them well, they'll be very small economic burdens, except for the local areas where special activities are going to be made, particularly for the farm workers. I'm not so worried about the large landowners. But if we manage this pretty well, we will have groundwater secure, which is going to be a great benefit for us in the drought-prone West. It'll provide much greater water security for urban areas, for the most profitable agriculture, and for ecosystems. So I would like to see this transition not as an unmitigated disaster, which it will be for some local areas, but really as a way of saving and restoring to sustainability the urban economies, the most profitable agriculture in these regions, as well as providing a lot more room for better managing ecosystems. And that larger economic base, which will continue to grow mostly in the urban areas, will provide an ability to address some of the more important residual problems that will be mostly in rural areas. So we're going to be in for some really big changes in the West in water management and agriculture. Again, probably losing 20 or 30% of agriculture, which is going to be maybe 10% loss in agricultural revenues because it'll be out of the lower value crops. But any large real regional disruptions that we have are going to be largely due to mismanagement. If we manage it well, it should be eminently survivable, if not profitable and improving the sustainability of our larger state economies and ecosystems for that matter. So that's the extent of my remarks.
Thank you very much, Jay. I was going to write this down, but I'll just say it. My takeaway from your presentation is buckle up. Okay, so I'm not sure if I have the order right, but on my list, we've got Thomas Harder next. Thomas, are you with us and ready to go?
I am with you and ready to go.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
So I'm Thomas Harder. I'm a distinguished professor and professor of cognitive extension at the University of California in Davis. I work on groundwater issues and I focus primarily on the agricultural landscape, mostly here in California, but I want to take Deb's amazing presentation and drill it down a little bit more into that and also sort of expand on that and provide a global perspective and what we're doing. And Deb has made it quite clear that groundwater is an important part of our water equation. It is about 1/3 nationally of our drinking water supply. And as Deb has pointed out, when it comes to domestic wells, there is about 41 million people that depend on their own domestic wells across the United States. For them, groundwater is the exclusive source of water. And if you look across the world, this is a map that shows, and let me see, I think you see a black bar on the right side. Let me get rid of that. If you look at domestic water use, there are many areas in the world where over 80% of domestic water use comes from groundwater, all across the continents. And what you see on this map as well is there are those areas that Deb and others have pointed out previously in the US that rely on groundwater for irrigation water in the Midwest and California. But you see these patterns repeated in other areas of the world, and mostly areas that are dry some of the time or most of the time. Southern Asia, Eastern China, places in Australia. These are places that all rely on groundwater when there's not enough surface water for irrigation. Let me briefly illustrate a little bit more about how this groundwater works. And I'm going to illustrate this for the California case. There's different groundwater settings all over this country and all over the world. In California, not all of our aquifer systems look like this. We have the mountains to the side of our valleys. The mountains are formed of hard rock. And then where we have valleys, we have eroded material from mountains or former oceans that fill this, what I call bathtub, with sediments, and these sediments are full of groundwater, where that groundwater in these sediments is refilled and replenished by recharge across the landscape from precipitation or from irrigation that is not consumed by crops and plants. It is also significantly recharged naturally by rivers when they first come out of the mountains on the upper part of these valleys. They start flowing from the hard rock onto these unconsolidated loose sediments and do a hefty amount of recharge into the subsurface, helping with groundwater recharge. And then it's usually at the center of a valley where we have a large river that not only drains the surface runoff and the rivers that come out of the mountains, but it also drains this groundwater in a full groundwater basin. And that happens both in large valleys and in small valleys. So when you're out west and it hasn't rained for 2 or 3 months and you step into a place like this where water is still flowing, that's because groundwater is flowing to that stream and feeding that stream as what we call base flow. When we pump water, we take some of that flow that goes to the stream or to the riparian vegetation near the stream away from that and use it for irrigation, which then goes to evapotranspiration. And ideally, this is done in a way where we use water in a dry season and then let it replenish in the wet season and kind of go back and forth in that way. There's places across the country where we have used more than is being replenished, and water tables fall, rivers become disconnected, and may eventually even go dry. This has been exacerbated in the Western United States over the past 20 years, 20 to 25 years, by what is now known to be the Western mega drought. If we look at the number of wet years and the number, or average in wet years, and the number of dry years in California, typically throughout the 20th century, with the exception of the late 1920s and early 1930s, you would find over any 20, 25-year period an even number of average and wet years to the number of dry years. But this unofficial simple groundwater score for California for the last 25 years looks very different. We have only had 9 average and wet years, and those are the years when we replenish our groundwater systems up and down the state, our small groundwater systems as well as our larger groundwater systems. And in these dry years is when we dip into that underground bank account of water and take some of that extra water out and lower our groundwater levels. And so over the past 25 years, we have seen significant shift in our climate that has had tremendous impact on groundwater resources across California and across the Western US. This map is showing wells that are at less than 25% of their typical water levels. They're exceedingly low, and we find this to be the case across the state as a result of this mega drought with, as Deb has already pointed out, numerous wells going dry. So this overuse of groundwater to make up for the lack of surface water, or to simply take advantage of it where you can produce an economic value from it, as we do in agriculture, has significant consequences. It increases the amount of the costs to do groundwater pumping. We have dry wells, which then means that you have to drill a new well, which is an expensive cost, especially for a household. Households fall dry. It's already been pointed out as well that we lose that connection to rivers. It has impacts to our ecosystems. And then in many, not all groundwater systems, when we lower water levels, there's fine-grained layers within our groundwater systems that collapse and cause what we call land subsidence. These are maps of recent land subsidence in the last decade, and land subsidence in the 20th century on the right-hand side, just here in the Central Valley, where in some places we have had land subsidence on the order of 30 feet. This is a famous picture from the late 1970s showing land subsidence in the San Joaquin Valley, but it's not something that's confined to California or Arizona. We have 17,000 square miles across the country that are affected by land subsidence, with significant costs to infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, water infrastructure, and homes. And this is a problem we see around the world. This is a map that was recently published of potential global subsidence areas. Again, often in areas where we do a lot of groundwater pumping, and that includes the Mississippi Basin, the High Plains Aquifer, the Central Aquifer in California, much of the Mediterranean region, the Indo-Gangetic Basin in South Asia, the North China Plains in China, and areas in Australia and South America. In all these regions, we also see seawater intrusion along the coast on account of lower groundwater levels, which then leads to complete deterioration of water quality. So this is an issue. This overdrafting and groundwater level decline is an issue in many of the major aquifer systems of the US and across the world. And I'm highlighting here these areas that I just spoke of, where we have much of that, where we see much of that or most of that groundwater level decline and overuse. And much of that is for agricultural production, that is for irrigation. And if I plot the same map with these same circles on a map that shows these continents not by their actual size, but by their population, what you notice is that these circles are in areas that have a very high population, which really speaks to this extensive link between food production and water resources. So the issues that we face in Western US and across the United States, where water resources are becoming scarcer and agriculture is finding it more and more difficult to get these water resources for their irrigation. Many of these places also feed a lot of people. On the water quality side, as has been pointed out by several of my fabulous previous speakers, we have water quality issues, some of which are, in fact, most of which are natural water quality issues. Deb pointed out, as you go deeper, you find poorer and poorer quality. The water that flows through the subsurface has accumulated more solutes as it passes by rocks and rock pieces. And much of the contamination that we see across the US is, in fact, what we call geogenic or naturally occurring. If we look at human-made contamination, there's a lot of the industrial contamination with organic chemicals. That's this bar on the right-hand side. But by far the largest contaminant that we find throughout the US is nitrate. And nitrate, again, occurs primarily in areas where we have a lot of farming because it is a side product of fertilizers and of manures, and where we have a lot of those uses both in the US and across the world, we often find also extensive nitrate contamination of groundwater. What do we do about this? We have talked about several solutions. I want to just sort of add a little bit to what my previous speakers have already said. One of the really key pieces that I find, especially in this at this nexus between managing groundwater in an agricultural landscape, is we're talking about many stakeholders, many landowners, many growers, many farmers, not just individual industries or individual companies. And so engaging with these many growers is different from engaging with an individual contaminating landfill or contaminating industry. We're talking about much larger need for outreach, a much larger need for collaboration, for negotiation. And so that stakeholder engagement is a very, very important part of finding solutions and negotiating solutions. Understanding our groundwater systems in the context of surface water, in the context of climate, having robust water budgets, having a good understanding of how water flows in the subsurface. This is my secret underground radar image of how groundwater flows from the landscape to wells, and how long that takes. Often not just a few days or months, but most often it's actually on the scale of decades to centuries. Having a clearer understanding of the structure of that subsurface and the flow in that subsurface, but also how that then connects to our natural landscapes and how natural landscapes depend on groundwater, is a really important prerequisite where that information needs to eventually flow to stakeholders that make decisions on where to set these thresholds that Deb talked about on all these different, what we call sustainability indicators, which are spelled out explicitly in the California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, but are implicitly used in other places as well. The lowering of groundwater levels and reduction of storage, issues with respect to seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and water quality, but also with respect to surface water depletion and groundwater dependent ecosystems. Specifically with respect to water quality, an important part is to understand management practices, both water management practices and nutrient management practices in the agricultural space. Research has been done in that space for many decades, but it has very much focused on surface water and surface water impacts from agricultural practices. And it's only been in a recent 2 decades that we've expanded on our research into understanding groundwater impacts that come from management practices, both water management practices and nutrient management practices, and developing solutions together with growers and farmers that will improve conditions, that will improve groundwater conditions, at least in the long run, if not in the intermediate future. So with that image, I think I'm out of my time and want to pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Thomas. That was fantastic. And thanks also for the last few slides on the, well, actually for bringing in the water quality part, but the very important component of the stakeholder engagement. It's just a quick anecdote. My daughter's now graduating with her PhD and moving into this space, actually in water. And although she's more ecosystem and carbon cycle modeling and remote sensing, but she just texted me about irrigation management software that many of our colleagues are trying to engage with. And she just texted me and said, farmers don't really like this irrigation software that all these people are doing in academics, and they don't seem to trust us. So building that trust, we know it's super important.
It is very, very important. And in fact, I'm actually at the University Council of Water Resources annual conference right now at Fort Collins. And that's much of what we've talked about, is building that trust with growers, building programs that work with growers and engage growers in a way that creates enthusiasm and buy-in into these technologies is a really important part.
And we know that, we've heard literally every previous speaker say we have to do this. It's agriculture. Of course, it uses all the water and we just have to work together. And, I also feel like we have to find, so of course we're engaging with the stakeholders, but I feel like we have to really find the champions that are out there as well, who can really, bring the others along. But maybe we save that for discussion and pass it on to Josh Veers, who's at UC Merced. And Josh, please remind us all just maybe one or two sentences about your background before you launch into your presentation. Love the cows, by the way.
Oh, yeah, it's all about the cows, Jay. Thanks for having me. Thanks to my fellow panelists. It's great to be here. Josh Veers, a less distinguished professor in the University of California. I'm a bit of a dabbling duck, focusing on climate, water, ag, ecosystems, and a little bit of geospatial in between. I'm at the University of California, Merced. For the viewers and participants that don't know as much about UCM, we're the 10th and newest campus of the University of California system. In less than 20 years, we've grown to almost 10,000 students. The cows that you see here, we still have some on our campus, but this particular pasture is now a LEED Platinum certified building, part of the largest public-private partnership in higher education, a $1.3 billion build in our second phase, 11 buildings in less than 3 years. That happened to coincide with the pandemic. They're now all filled up, and they're filled up with 99% of students from California. 88% of those are one or more underserved demographics. 3 out of 4 first-generation college goers. 2 out of 3 receive federal aid. 1 out of 10 are undocumented. We're at the epicenter of all the issues that we're talking about, located in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. So the issues around subsidence and dry wells for our local communities, underserved communities, those are all things that we live in the very present. And so when Jay talks about the difficulty at the local level, we're certainly in the midst of that and working with our community to best understand the way forward. So I'm just going to try to fill in a few of the pieces to the conversation that we've had. I'll go pretty quickly so that we can get to some conversation. One of the things we know is that California is a little crazy when it comes to water. This is surface water allocation by water year type for the major basins in and around Merced, the Stanislaus River, Tuolumne, Merced, and Upper San Joaquin, by the different entities that actually move that surface water around. whether those are utilities or even the Bureau of Reclamation. There's very little consistency in these unless it's in an exceptional wet year like this year. So I think we would all agree it's wet, but determining what is perhaps normal, below normal, dry, et cetera. I'd also point out the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation thinks that wet is normal, whereas I would say that normal is probably dry, and we should be thinking that the exception is when it's wet. But surface water is the key to all of our groundwater problems. And the reason being is that the demand is much, much greater than the supply. So there's about 5 million acres of ag in the San Joaquin Valley, as we've talked about. I just note that a lot of that is in perennial agriculture. This is a hardened demand that doesn't have a lot of flexibility in the system when we tend to run short, and hence the reason that we've been going to the depths of our groundwater supply, overdrafting upwards of 2 million acre feet annually. And so that certainly poses some significant problems. Just to put it in perspective, in and around Merced, natural recharge without a surface water supply is about 8 inches. That's about 20% of demand for something like almonds. We're producing 80% of the global almond supply, nearly 100% for the United States. So that means either we can grow on a fifth of the land, or we could grow almonds every 5th year. And we know that the latter doesn't work very well. One of the things that concerns me most, and this is some work that is in review right now, but I wanted to share with the participants, is that since about 2011, 2012, we've noted a significant shift towards a hot, dry climate, which has increased the evapotranspirative demand over agricultural areas by about 5%, pretty significantly. And if we looked at 2021, which was a very hot year and also exceptionally dry, that resulted in about 2.5 inches of the extra evapotranspirative demand over the San Joaquin Valley. So 2.5 inches over 5 million acres of ag is 1 million acre feet. So that 2 million acre feet of overdraft plus an additional 1 million acre feet going to the atmosphere is a significant amount of water. That's 1.5 of our largest reservoirs in the region. The Merced River itself is about 1 million acre feet on a good year. And so making up that difference is going to be a significant challenge for us going forward. Also note that 8 of the 10 warmest years in the last several decades has been in the most recent decade. It remains a significant challenge for us as we go forward. The cumulative anomaly departure from that baseline, effectively the precipitation minus the crop evapotranspiration, is a deficit that is just now starting to be realized over the last decade or so. This recent year will bump us back up by about 400 millimeters possibly, but we're going to remain in deficit for some time. I think this decadal mega drought that we've been talking about is something that we will be contending with. Thus, this invisible tax, as we're calling it, of water going to the atmosphere is going to remain a significant challenge as we look to balance both supply and demand. Has been noted by many of the speakers and the crisis in the Colorado River. There's a lot of consternation about what to do about surface water in that system and elsewhere. And Jay noted, a strong demand for environmental water. About 50% of the water here is going to livestock, as it's indicated. And there was a nice paper by Brian Richter and others really trying to unpack where some of that water goes. That said, there's been also some hyperbole about, the use of water for forage crops and in particular for alfalfa. And I was curious about this in part because having worked, throughout the valley and thought about alfalfa as a means by which we could actually use it as a potential flex crop, it just struck me as that the conversation perhaps isn't as fruitful as it could be. And the reason being is that alfalfa is particularly efficient when it comes to irrigation. It's fairly low input, certainly doesn't require any fertilizer as it's a nitrogen fixing perennial. A lot of work by Helen Dalk and others has shown that up to 6 feet of managed aquifer recharge can be achieved by overwinter flood irrigation. It's critical habitat for Swainson's hawk, for foraging, and a number of other things. And a lot of indication that it could be highly flexible in a place like the San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Lake Basin, where there are a lot of perennial crops. almonds, pistachios, walnuts, pomegranates, citrus, things like that. And so more recently, we've been taking a harder look at what the possibilities might be for using alfalfa as a flex crop. And this is very much in progress work. But looking at the San Joaquin, Tulare Lake Basin, Imperial Valley area, there's nearly 500,000 acres of alfalfa that's in production. And it can use anywhere from 4 to 6.5 feet of water in some cases. And so looking under a business as usual base case versus going to a midsummer deficit. And to explain that would be shutting off the water on July 1 and limiting alfalfa production to about 5 cuttings. And looking at the net returns over a 3-year period under those cases, under different pricing models at $50, $100, and $200 per acre foot, we can see that being able to cut off midsummer at fairly low dollar price for the water, certainly the growers would be taking a hit, but there is substantial revenue there as water creeps up towards $200 an acre foot. Alfalfa is just no longer profitable, and those alternative land management practices that we've been thinking about, whether it's solar panels or perhaps even homes, might come into play. But if we want to be able to keep the open space and some of the other ancillary benefits associated with this agricultural space and perhaps provide some greater flexibility to that landscape, being able to put some of this extra water back into the marketplace has shown that, at least in this initial assessment, that the revenues are actually almost identical to what would be achieved under the best base case scenario. So we think that this has some promise. And to put it in perspective, that deficit irrigation is about a 50% reduction, which is about 2 feet. And so that's, putting us certainly in about 1 million acre feet of water savings that could be put to some additional uses. So I think that there's some positivity there for us to look at going forward. That said, when it comes to water markets, this is some additional in progress work. We did a survey of 100 growers, water managers, ecosystem managers across California, New Mexico, and Utah. When they were asked who's going to benefit from the water markets going from top to bottom, the bottom are the big beneficiaries in the perspective of these respondents, and that's large growers. Whereas at the top, those that are going to benefit the least in their perspective are the small growers and themselves. And so I think as we look to identify barriers to entry, they note the lack of water to trade, they note the lack of transparency in trading mechanisms, and the difficulty in accessing those trading systems remain significant barriers to being able to enter a market-based approach to trading water and receiving some of those benefits. I'd also like to point out that perceptions and knowledge around some of these things, including the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, are highly compromised. So this survey that had about 200 respondents by SMS text across all the underserved communities in the San Joaquin Valley, over 1/2 of those respondents had no familiarity whatsoever with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And about 2/3 of them, combined, only knew something very little about it. So when we think about the alternative land, multi-benefit land repurposing and the different things that they may want to do with this land aside from ag, they don't even really understand what's in motion right now. So I think we could do a better job reaching out to these communities that are going to be most affected. And then in closing, really just trying to think a little bit about the polarization, not just in politics, but in perceptions. This particular paper looked at 325 newspaper articles in California during the height of the drought and how it related to SGMA. And what I'll point out is the stark divide between left and right. And on the left, you have agriculture that's and perhaps water managers. And on the right, you have academics and regulators and research solutions and so forth. And then from top to bottom, the difference between demand and supply. And then changes in law, such as water rights and the creation of infrastructure. And that becomes really important as we think about who the stakeholders are and what the solutions are. And so on the left, these are the number of articles that mention different types of stakeholders. And I'd like to point out that the perspective of regulators and especially academics is not well represented in the popular press. And so as we go to work with the general public and the stakeholders across the region, I think we would do better to be able to voice our knowledge and interests and to provide solutions. When it comes to solutions on the right, there is a huge difference between those who think it's a supply side issue and those who think it's a demand side issue. And so the blue bars show the urban newspapers, which are 2-to-1 focused on demand versus supply. And then the yellow bar on the right is in the Tulare Lake Basin, and that's a 2-to-1 focus on supply solutions rather than demand. Those are highly correlated with interest in infrastructure as well. And I'll just go so far as to say that, just because you can build a cup doesn't mean it's going to fill with water. So that remains a significant challenge for us as we try to find these solutions. So in closing, just like to thank the USDA for the support, my colleagues at a number of different institutions that are part of our Secure Water Future program. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Josh. Really appreciate that presentation, and as usual, extremely eye-opening. Why don't we take about 10 minutes, since we only have 2 speakers in the last panel. Let's take about 10 minutes for some discussion, and let me ask if any of our board members have questions. And in the meantime, Robin, if you can find out if there's any questions from outside listeners. Bernadette, I did see your hand.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you all. That was a very good presentation as well. When we talk about how we do a better job with reaching out to the stakeholders, I know scientists, we get into the weeds, we can get very complicated, and we want to make sure it's communicated clearly. How often do you encourage behavioral scientists to participate in these meetings with the stakeholders to enhance, that communication as one aspect of enhancing their awareness and listening to them and bringing them together? Because I think you highlighted very much how important building trust is. These are really challenging issues. The livelihoods are being impacted. But I was just curious, with your experience and how you're dealing with these stakeholders, has that been something that has been embraced, or is there other solutions for enhancing that communication with the groups when you meet with them, because they are so diverse and each interest is, of course, what's in it for me or how am I impacted? I'd love your feedback on that. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in here and sort of share a little bit from my perspective. Of course, being in cooperative extension, that is all about reaching out to stakeholders, and it is not just growers and farmers, but it's the affected communities as well. And at least in California, and I think this is true, I think across the country, social sciences are a significant part of cooperative extension, and social scientists are a significant part of cooperative extension. And cooperative extension has a very deep reach into especially rural communities through the 4-H program, but also through other programs. So that's one aspect. And for me, in my work, has been a key to reaching agricultural stakeholders and the communities and those that represent the communities where these farms are located. The other piece that I wanted to share is, in California, at least, the Department of Water Resources, which has overseen the development of the local groundwater sustainability plans. We have developed something like 150 groundwater sustainability plans by some over 200 local groundwater sustainability agencies. There was significant amount of funding during the development of these plans between 2018 and 2022 for facilitation. And the DWR had hired or contracted with facilitation services to actually help with this process of developing these groundwater sustainability plans amongst local stakeholders. I was the part of the technical service providing team in Siskiyou County. We've had 3 basins, and we had, in each of those basins, we had a advisory committee that essentially, a committee of local stakeholders that developed the groundwater sustainability plans. And these facilitation services were hugely important to make these conversations happen and to make sure that everybody has a fair seat at the table.
I guess I'd sort of like to add a little bit to that excellent response. I think managing these conversations is very difficult. Not all social scientists are particularly adept at managing conversations. If you've ever been to a faculty meeting, you'll understand why. But everyone has a responsibility for managing these conversations. And as Thomas points out, quite often a professional facilitator is really needed. Although quite often I think they're not needed as much as other people developing abilities to talk to each other.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Thanks for those responses, Bernadette. Thanks for that question. Any other questions from board members? Or questions from the outside? Robin, I don't know if you've got a pipeline there. I'm not checking any email or anything, so I don't know if people are sending me questions.
Well, there is really kind of a related question, which is since most ag water use transitions are likely to be local and market driven, what are the factors or policies needed so that the transitions are well managed? My guess meaning taking into account who's going to be more severely affected by it.
Any takers on our panel?
Yeah, I think one of the things that disturbs me in looking at some of the proposals for the Colorado River is it's all about paying the large landowners and the large agribusinesses that control the land to farm less. And farm workers and the local businesses are really kind of left on the hook. So I really think that the state and federal subsidies, and I think there's some need for those, be targeted to the things that will really help with the economic resilience of those regions. My favorite suggestion is to improve the education systems in those regions, because nothing attracts new industries like a well-educated, capable workforce. And then if you fail in your ability to bring in new industries, you've also enhanced the ability of those people to leave, like we do in many other sectors where a region has found that its economic base is dissolved or moved to a different part of the world.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, Robin, go ahead.
Well, I had a question about, I think in the last session, Felicia said that she thought that some estimates are that 1.5 million acres would have to be repurposed or go fallow in California. And I just wondered, do the presenters in this panel agree with that kind of estimate as like a target or something that's going to have to happen? And then was it Jay, you said 10%, that represents some 10% of revenues from agriculture in California?
I think it'll be on that order. Yeah. I mean, just from looking at some of the drought impact studies that have been done at UC Davis and UC Merced, that seems to be about a reasonable ballpark. And I do think that 20 to 30% of irrigated agriculture applies to most of the West. You know, when I look at the stuff for the Colorado Basin and a little bit for Utah, as well as for California in general. For California, I think we're looking at a absolute minimum of about 500,000 acres of irrigated agriculture going out of production just to comply with SGMA. But in addition to that, we have additional reductions that we're going to have to accommodate to a drier climate. So climate change. And in addition, we're going to have to fallow even more lands to provide more water for the environment. I'm intrigued by Josh's suggestion analysis on reducing the intensity of alfalfa irrigation, which I think is has a lot of potential, is very promising, but it still is on the average scale, it'll be about 20 to 30% of irrigated agriculture being either less intensivized or going to some other purpose. which is actually an important resource for ecosystem restoration, particularly if you can think of dry land types of ecosystems that you want to support. And many of these areas were naturally a dry land ecosystem for the most part.
So I was also intrigued, Josh, by some of those numbers, especially the numbers on ET. Thank you for that. And just kind of wrap it up and move on to our last panel. A couple of things on the stakeholder engagement. So, Deb's work in this paper that's just coming out showed pretty clearly that when stakeholders are involved in some of these groundwater sustainability plans, they can certainly be effective and keep a smaller number of wells from going dry. And then on the other hand, we've got Josh's survey, which I thought was great, which shows sort of the polarization, and is it supply, is it demand, and also the lack of the voices of researchers and academics. And so it should be no surprise to this crew and I know you're all great communicators, but we really need to encourage our colleagues or do more within our universities to get that information out and to build those relationships. Because one of the things about all of us in academics is that we're the sort of keepers of the information over many, many, many years. We devote our careers to it, and we train all these students, and it's different than an elected official who's in and out in a few years. So so with that, let's move on. So thank you very much to this second panel. Really, really appreciate your time. And I'm trying to find my agenda so I can introduce our last panel, which is on technology. And we have AJ Purdy and Michael Roberts joining us. So again, I'll ask, so AJ is from Cal State University Monterey Bay, now working with OpenET. And Michael Roberts has, the dream job location that all of us want. Anyway, I'll turn it over to each of you, and please, just as a reminder, please, so AJ, you'll go next, but please give us a sentence or two on your background before you launch in. So over to you, AJ.
Thanks, Jay. No, it's great to be here. And so I'm a research scientist here at Cal State Monterey Bay. My background is actually in watershed science and policy, but then also I had the fortune of studying and doing my PhD under Jay down at UC Irvine. And so my background's in remote sensing and evapotranspiration. And I'm fortunate to be able to present today on behalf of the OpenET team. And so as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, there are a number of team members from federal agencies, nonprofits, private sector, and multiple universities across the United States. And so I'll be just presenting on, it's like how we're filling this really big gap in data as it relates to water management. But in order to kind of start off, I thought I'd just get going by starting, with what evapotranspiration actually is. It's a mouthful of a word, but it's really important in the context of water management. And so when water is applied to a field, it can go a number of ways. It can infiltrate into the soil and recharge groundwater and run off on the surface to nearby canals or streams. But in addition to that, it can evaporate from the soil or transpire through plants, and the combination of which is evapotranspiration. But in the context of water management, it's really important because it's representative of the consumptive use of water. It's that water that cannot be recaptured or reused. So having very accurate ET data arguably is one of the needs to support water management. And due to its importance over a number of years, there have been many models and modeling teams that have worked on the challenge of providing ET data everywhere. Satellites apply a number of approaches. Some include biophysical stressors. Others utilize plant phenology to mimic crop coefficients. But then there are a set of models that actually rely on the surface energy balance to quantify actual ET rates. This relies on that key principle that ET consumes energy. It takes a lot of energy to convert water from its liquid form to its vapor form. And so when we think of the surface energy balance, that's really where the energy from the sun comes in. Some of that energy heats the ground heat flux. Other parts of that energy, end up heating the air, sensible heat, but a large fraction of that energy actually goes towards ET. And so using this information, as well as thermal observations from satellites, we can harness the data to accurately model ET across the landscape. These images on the right just showcase, like the value of thermal observations in this context. The top image just being true color, what we see with our eyes, but the bottom image shows the thermal signature of this area. And so, since ET consumes energy, those areas that are going to be red or hotter means there's less ET, more of that energy is, heating the land, heating the air. But in the cooler areas, that would be more indicative of a higher ET rate. And beyond that, evapotranspiration is also controlled by the amount of vegetation and the atmospheric demand for water. And so we rely on, shortwave and near infrared observations to map, where vegetation is abundant and healthy. But in addition to that, we also need to have very accurate meteorological data to support quantifying the atmospheric demand for water. As I mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of teams that have worked on this challenge for many, many years. Some of the models are, decades old now, but a lot of these developments have been done in silo, and data have been produced, but not necessarily shared or distributed in a way that is useful for applications. And so, up until 2021, this is what the availability of ET data across the United States really looked like, right? It's the blank picture. But in 2021, the OpenET team was able to produce, ET data for every quarter acre across the United States. The OpenET kind of like modeling infrastructure runs actually 6 models using Google Earth Engine, and stores and distributes data in a number of ways. We don't just produce data at Landsat scene images. It's also provided in daily and monthly formats, which are needed for adoption in decision support. Currently, the data are available from about 2017 to present, but we plan to harness the historical images and produce longer records of ET to support longer term studies that are needed to help quantify the consumptive use, dating back to the 1980s. And then one thing I just want to highlight before I move on here is that a lot of these data have been thoroughly evaluated across the United States using a series of eddy covariance towers. But beyond those, quarter acre estimates, the data are actually also being summarized in, field boundaries. And so this has been an enormous effort to go along with all of the modeling teams' contributions over the years. Assembling a geodatabase to do this provides an easier way to access this information by summarizing that data within a given boundary. You can see here in this screenshot of the OpenET Data Explorer that you can zoom into a region, point and click on the field, and retrieve a time series in a matter of seconds. This just wasn't possible, as recently as like 2 years ago. And this point and click functionality is necessary in order to support things like irrigation decision support, or quantify potential water savings by, looking at the different varieties of crops grown in your area and considering the trade-offs from planting one crop or another. And speaking of that accuracy assessment, some of the values that OpenET kind of like lives by are, providing a reliable source of data, providing accurate source of ET data. The accuracy is really important in order to help inform decisions. And to this point, the team here has actually done one of the largest intercomparisons to date. Data from 150 flux towers have been used to create a new benchmark data set to evaluate satellite, driven models. And you can see this figure on the right just points to how in croplands over the water year, we're actually meeting accuracy requirements that were outlined in earlier outreach for decision support. So those mean absolute errors are under the 10% threshold that was set. But beyond croplands, the data are being evaluated in natural systems as well. And so there's going to be an upcoming paper shortly kind of showcasing the accuracy, not just of the 6 individual models, but also the ensemble estimate. But beyond having, a reliable source of data, the team is also dedicated to transparency and equal access. And this means providing data through a number of avenues. And so, easing access to increased adoption is really necessary to get the data in the hands of people making decisions. And so the team actually provides data in a number of ways, one of which is through an application programming interface, where you can see the images on the right side of the screen, kind of cycling through the different options in which the data are accessible through that program. There's a number of endpoints in which you can extract data by a given time series or an image and a map of a region. But beyond that, providing the data through forums such as the Google Earth Engine, as well as that Data Explorer, which kind of is just that point and click functionality. And when you think of, it's like the providing equal access, this means providing data to people everywhere. So for many rural communities, for instance, that might have bandwidth limitations, just downloading terabytes or hundreds of gigabytes of data just isn't possible. And so just as valuable as the science was to kind of meet those accuracy requirements that I presented earlier, just as important was all the effort over the last 7 years that's gone into reducing the need to download, hundreds of gigabytes of data all the way down to megabytes or even kilobytes, for instance, for a time series for a given field. And this success has really been part of, just as valuable as that science that I mentioned earlier. And so one application in kind of value of showcasing that data, I'll just kind of present a short video here from one of our partners.
We're under a drought in most of the West contiguously. The climate is changing. Summers are getting longer, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, we're getting less precipitation. So I think there's a growing awareness in all of the West that we have to use significantly less water. So agriculture has to figure out how to get as much per drop of water as they can. I started to try to understand evapotranspiration when we collectively started trying to figure out, can I put less water on my fields and still yield the same amount or more? I go online and I can pull up the evapotranspiration numbers. I compare the amount of water that I apply daily, weekly, probably monthly, compared to what OpenET says. And I can see if I'm over applying or under applying. So if I put on more water than evapotranspiration I already have in my bank, I can shut off for a couple of days. That means we can use about 25% less water and still produce the same amount of crop, which means a lot if you're putting out several million gallons of water a day.
And so as we just heard from Mark Owens there, the ET data can be used to help improve, irrigation decision support. And, essentially it boils down to tools like OpenET do provide the capability for helping farmers do more with less. As part of a lot of the outreach and co-development, we recognize that while we can produce data everywhere, the challenges are often local. But key to successful adoption has really been using that co-development model. So integrating stakeholders into the design process for how data can be delivered to kind of meet their needs. And so, beyond, providing irrigation decision support, we really hope to help provide rural communities with, new tools to help design water conservation programs, help water managers create more accurate water budgets by closing that gap and providing accurate evapotranspiration data. But beyond that, in terms of policymakers, providing accurate ET estimates really helps and provides an avenue to potentially simplify the regulatory compliance. One success story from this lens is really a recent project called the Delta ACP. an alternative compliance program in the Sacramento Bay Delta area, where people that divert a certain amount of water can actually use OpenET data now if they don't want to install a point at the point of diversion. But what's next for OpenET? Obviously we only cover the Western United States, and so covering the entire continental United States will be achieved soon. This does come with challenges, though. As you move east, there's increased cloud cover, and so ensuring that we still maintain accuracy in these conditions is essential. And that kind of relates to these following points here that I'll wrap up with. That we really seek for iterative improvement, trying to figure out how to tackle these challenges by integrating more frequent land surface temperature observations, working towards more accurate meteorological data. There are certain states that have great weather networks to really support quantifying what the atmospheric demand for ET is, but other parts of the country don't quite have those networks in place yet. And when you move beyond the United States, that's a really big limitation to applying these methods in other countries. And then lastly, always looking forward to the next set of new satellite observations and figuring out ways to harness the new information that's going to be coming through hyperspectral observations, as well as land surface temperature observations at different times of the day. And with that, I just want to acknowledge all of the contributing members to this effort, and leave this last slide. If people have any questions later on, I'd be happy to answer them at the discussion time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, AJ. It's a great presentation. For those of you who haven't played around with OpenET, I suggest that you do. It's really simple to use. I've used it in my research, and I think I saw that Josh used it in one of his papers. I'm not sure. I thought I saw OpenET in there, so it's getting a lot of uptake with stakeholders and with researchers. And as AJ showed you, it's been heavily validated with all the flux towers. So really an important development. I think we are on to our last speaker, who is Michael Roberts. Thank you for joining us today. And again, I wanted to see palm trees or whatever, crashing waves in the background, but it's okay. And so please, again, remind us about your background, and then we can launch into your presentation. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to speak with all of you, and and even more so, really, to listen to everyone's expertise here. I'm not really focused on water per se, but more on agriculture and climate change impacts. And I've actually been doing a little bit less of that recently because I've transitioned to doing work on solving the larger problem of climate change, and trying to think about how to decarbonize. So I've been doing more work on energy. So anyhow, I'm a professor here at the University of Hawaii. I've been here about 10 years now. And before that, I was at NC State and the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., and have focused a lot on kind of Midwestern staple grains agriculture, corn and soybeans and things like that. But I think what I'll talk about today is relevant more generally. And I think it really relates to what AJ was talking about, really, really amazing work on ET that I can imagine a zillion applications of. Let me go ahead and try to share my slides. Let me see if I can go into presentation mode here. Everyone see that? Is it?
Yeah, it's one big slide.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the link between extreme heat and crop outcomes, which something I've been doing with Wolfram Schlenker starting a while ago, probably 15 years ago or more. And I'll talk about the implications of that for crop outcomes, and also especially for water demand, which really relates to AJ's talk and some of what other people have said in terms of the link between climate and ET. So, you know, a lot of people here are talking about changes in water supply and its allocation in light of climate change. And so a claim I want to make that I think is at least somewhat justified is that the effect of climate change on water demand could be just as important, and that acting through two channels in basically ET can increase dramatically as the climate changes. And then, of course, as output increases, the prices could go up for crops because there's less available, and that will increase demand even more. This hasn't been completely quantified, but I want to show you some of the underpinnings of what I think is there and what I'm not sure that we fully understand yet. So this is kind of a picture from our paper in PNAS that looks at the link between corn yields and temperature, and the methods that we use to kind of unpack this link between temperatures and crop outcomes has been then used to show links between extreme heat and lots of other outcomes. It looks like, you know, warmer temperatures are good for crop yields up to a certain point, and then yields kind of fall off a cliff. And if you extrapolate this in kind of a naive way to look at the impacts of climate change with projected changes in temperatures, the impacts are so large that no one really wants to contemplate them. And this is probably the highest concentration of caloric production in the world in the Midwestern Corn Belt. So to contemplate, you know, 60 to 80% reductions in yields would really have remarkable impacts on crop prices globally. There's a lot of variation in this sensitivity to extreme heat. There's less sensitivity in areas with hotter climates. There's less sensitivity in highly irrigated climates. So there's your adaptation, I guess. But it's watering crops with a lot more, taking a lot more water to. It's going to be hard to do given everything that you've seen so far. The sensitivity has varied over time, but it appears especially sensitive more recently. So the sensitivity to extreme heat seems to be getting worse. And within crop growing season, sensitivity appears greatest right around flowering and early grain filling, basically when the crops are at their biggest and they're consuming the most water. Process-based crop models, which are typically used to assess the potential impacts of climate change and have been since the early IPCC reports, do not seem to typically capture this extreme heat effect. If you do this on a large scale. I tend to do work on farmer fields rather than experiment stations, and the crop models tend to be focused on experiment stations in more controlled environments. When we've tried to simulate this on a very large environment, we've used a statistical model that just takes the raw relationships between the weather and the crop outcomes, and we simulate about 1 million fields using a crop model. And this is one of the crop models that I found predicts outcomes the best by Soltani and Sinclair. It doesn't seem to capture this extreme heat effect. And this graph kind of shows that. And then we can combine the process models and statistical models to try to get the best kind of encompassing model. And all of these show a much larger response to extreme heat than the process models do. This is work in progress where we used another pretty recent model, or someone from a lab that seems to appreciate more the effects of extreme heat, but it doesn't capture the big heat wave we had in 2012 at all when we simulated this on a very, very large scale. So 3 things I want to briefly touch on. What's the mechanism of this extreme heat effect? I'll talk a little bit about adaptation. Economists in particular like to think about, adaptation will adapt to climate change. We'll just irrigate more is what some folks say. I think that's pretty difficult. Adaptation, I put in quotes because adaptation we have a fairly specific definition of that in much of the economics literature, although not all of it. But most of it has a specific definition, and that's what I'm going to address there. And then I'm going to talk about how lucky we seem to have been, at least maybe not in the West. We've had some major droughts, but in the East and where this major production regions are. Okay, first, what's the underlying mechanism of extreme heat? It looks like most of it is really coming from very, very high ET during extreme heat spells, which quickly dries out the land because we have a lot of very large crops, and water demand from the crops is very, very high during these spells. You could also get accelerated maturation of the crops, so there's less exposure to sunlight over the growing season. So you basically just get less photosynthesis and less energy into your crop, and therefore get a lower yield. There's increased pest pressure when temperatures are much higher, and other forms of temperature sensitivity during the flowering and grain filling stages. It looks like that's just a sensitive time for many crops. And almost surely there are compound effects. You can shut down ET, or you can have crops that are a little bit more drought tolerant that shut down ET during dry times and therefore preserve some of the moisture in the ground. But if you do that, you get some yield drag, and also the canopy gets much hotter and therefore more susceptible to temperature damages. So it can be very complex interactions. Some of the hints for this is that this extreme heat measure that we've been using, degree days above 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, is a common measure for extreme heat that seems to correlate very well with crop outcomes. The best single metric that we can come up with correlates very strongly with vapor pressure deficit, which is a measure of humidity that is linearly related to evaporation and evapotranspiration. But VPD tends to be exponentially related to temperatures. So this is why we get this very nonlinear effect. So there's a roughly 90% correlation between July and August VPD in this graph, this just simple correlation graph, with extreme heat. And you can also see in this graph that both VPD and extreme temperatures, HDD, in this correlation plot correlate very strongly with crop outcomes. This is for Illinois, kind of the center of the Corn Belt. We've tried to unpack this, and with one crop model, I should say, in a few sites. This is led by my colleague David LaBelle at Stanford, who's got much more reputable person in this area than I am. But we wrote this article, and some calibrations of APSIM, we can replicate this extreme heat effect, and it seems to come from very high ET. This kind of shows the simulations that we have, that as the temperatures increase, on the right-hand side, you can see that soil water demand just increases dramatically. And then you can look at the balance of supply and demand over kind of a simulated season. And that, under high temperature periods, you basically just get water demand from the crop that just outstrips supply, and then you get damages to yield. So now this is so David has been working really hard to build bridges with the crop scientists, and I think crop scientists are trying pretty hard to understand this. And I'm an economist, I'm kind of a hack of a agronomist to try to unpack all this, but I still think that there's a lot we need to understand and reconcile with the crop models. There was a comment on this paper where some of the crop models really took issue with the high ET rates that we had here, and they just didn't believe that ET was that high when the temperatures got hot. But empirically, it really looks like ET is that high. which means that water demand could be much higher than we imagine. This is a really neat paper by Ariel Ortiz-Obia and co-authors that tries to unpack temperature effects and soil and moisture effects from crops. And he seems to come out that soil and moisture is a big part of it, but temperatures are a big part of it too. But again, there could be pretty large compound effects that interact between the soil and moisture effects and the temperature effects. So this seems pretty consistent, but suggests there might be something else there also with extreme heat besides just soil moisture. Okay, adaptation. Climate's going to change, and we're going to have these problems to deal with. Can we adapt? A common definition here for adaptation that seems to be applied by economists is to account for how decisions will change as the climate changes, holding all else the same, including prices. Critical things that I think perhaps matter more than this definition of adaptation would be response to prices, for one, and second, induced innovation, which are more subtle, but I think there's ample evidence that people will respond to prices and there will be induced innovation. But that's not what I'm talking about here. So what are some strategies for this sort of conventional notion of adaptation? You can irrigate a lot, but cheaper water seems very unlikely given everything you've seen so far. You can breed drought tolerance, but drought tolerance means much less yield potential and possibly more heat damage, which I just described. You can have faster maturing varieties and try to avoid the extreme heat, but this also means much lower yield potential. Reduce planting density. High density planting of crops appears to be one of the reasons why evapotranspiration has increased a lot more recently, or sensitivity to extreme heat and EPD has increased a lot more recently. But this also, of course, will lower yield potential. You can plant earlier, but then you risk frost and you might have fields that are too wet to plant. You can change your crop, but that means lower value or a higher cost. So there's this thing called an envelope theorem in economics that basically says all of these choices are already very, very delicately optimized through trial and error, if nothing else. So adjustments in response to a changing climate are actually, as a first approximation, going to be minimal. In fact, approximately zero. So we should probably expect that these forms of adaptation are probably not going to help very much on net. And the encompassing evidence agrees with that. If you look at the pure cross-section, which accounts for adaptation to a person's climate, and the pure time series, which kind of deals with random variations in weather outcomes from year to year, you get very similar, nonlinear, in fact, statistically indistinguishable sensitivities to extreme heat in the cross-section and time series, which suggests that adaptation is difficult. And perhaps the best evidence of this is by Burke and Emmerich in 2016 showed that very long-run differences, you have different amounts of warming in different areas, and you get the same relationship when looking at long differences that kind of account for climate change, not just weather changes, as you get with weather. So in the last point, number 3, have we been lucky? There's been a huge warming hole in just the right place to benefit crop production. So first, this is a little bit of the earlier evidence that we had that sensitivity appeared to be fairly high to extreme heat very early on. It seemed to get less sensitive to extreme heat, but more recently, crops appear as sensitive as ever, and maybe more so to extreme heat. This is a paper in Science back in 2014 with David LaBelle again leading, where we documented this with a huge sample of field level data that we no longer have access to from the Risk Management Agency at USDA, where we documented how areas, this extreme sensitivity to vapor pressure deficit, which is basically mid-season extreme heat, is the most important predictor of crop yields. And the trend in areas with the greatest exposure to this is lowest. So this is one indication that these areas, the sensitivity to this factor are growing over time. And why is that? Possibly because we've had strangely incredibly good weather. Peter Hoybers at Harvard has been doing a lot of work trying to look at various reasons why our findings aren't as dire as they seem, and has written a couple papers about this. But there's this is a very recent map that kind of demonstrates this huge warming hole, that the changes in temperatures from the 1930s to the last decade, warmed to most places, but of course there's the Dust Bowl in the 1930s and really terrible heat in the United States, probably because of the way land was managed back then. But also there's been cooling more recently, and right over these very, very important production regions for corn and soybeans and other staple grains and oilseeds. So the weather that matters most has been astonishingly good recently. And if this ends or reverses, which seems inevitable, water demand for corn and soybeans will grow enormously. Some counterpoints to this. Some claim that corn and high ET are actually cooling the Midwest. And so this is kind of a compensating differential, that we're cooling the climate with massive agriculture. CO2 fertilization may compensate by boosting water use efficiency and yield. That it's very hard to disentangle CO2 effects from broader technological change, but both have probably been occurring so far. And there is evidence of induced innovation from long-run trends, differential trends in climate, for induced innovation on the crops, and particularly things like drought sensitivity. And that's fairly recent work from Moscana and Sastry in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And finally, a hotter future may also be wetter and more humid. So VPD may not go up as much as we might nominally predict. And so maybe we won't get quite as much increase in water demand as kind of the simple measures I've presented suggest. Okay, that's it. That's all I've got. Hopefully that is useful. But basic point is that we really need to think about water demand as well as water supply. And I suspect while it's harder to see in yield outcomes, in the West we've seen we've seen a lot of growth in ET as well as reduced supply. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. That was great. I did not know at all about the warming hole. And when you first put it on there, I actually thought it was wormhole. Anyway, let's take some questions. Let's start with the board, and we only have about 11 minutes left, and we do want to end right at the top of the hour. Any questions from the board for AJ or for Michael? And if there are no questions, well, I have a question. And Al's got a question. Go for it, Al.
There we go. Thanks. I put this question in the chat for Michael. But in terms of the alternative strategies that you laid out there in your slide, do you see any promise in genetic modification of crops as a means of decreasing or increasing drought tolerance without decreasing yields?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm probably not the best expert to answer that question, but I have spent a lot of time talking, particularly with Tom Sinclair, who seems to be an expert of all stripes in agronomy and crop science, and he was very, very skeptical of that. We have drought tolerant varieties for corn and soybeans, and that basically came out as an accident, is my understanding, because having deeper roots was really good for other factors that they were trying to engineer, and these deeper roots meant better drought tolerance. But there have been compensating differentials, so you plant more, you have higher seeding densities, and so as we've expanded GM crops and even the drought tolerant varieties, it is really clear that sensitivity to extreme heat has actually increased. So I find that kind of ironic, and there was a lot of controversy about our paper in Science for that reason, and I got kind of yelled at by some folks from Monsanto once when I presented some of that earlier work. They did not like that result, and didn't want to agree with it. I was kind of blindsided by it. I didn't realize they'd take issue with it. But what Tom Sinclair would say is that the processes that are involved here are very complex. Photosynthesis is a very old thing, evolutionary trait, and highly optimized over billions of years of evolution. And genetic engineering, at least so far, has been very good at single gene or maybe two genes if we're lucky manipulation. But this is genetic engineering that would require many genes, and is incredibly complex, and it's hard to beat what nature's already come up with, given how old the evolution is. That's not me. That's kind of what I've gotten. That's been my take from talking with other expert crop scientists. So, and empirically, I just know the data that we've seen so far. So that would be my response to that. And what we should probably focus on, though, the other thing that Tom Sinclair said, traditional breeding is great. That's genetic manipulation, and it's much more flexible because you can attack all the whole genome at once rather than just one genome at a time.
Mm-hmm. So we did want to we tried to get a crop breeder on this particular panel, actually. And this particular person couldn't make it, but we will certainly try to do that in the future. And this person, so I actually took a screenshot of your slide with the different things that need to be done. And there's a lot of work that's going on. Of course, a lot of work that's going on that. So we'll have to get some crop breeding representation on for future discussions. And then if we're fortunate enough to move this activity to a full study, maybe one time for one more question before we wrap it up. Robin, anything from
Well, one naive question for me, and then there is one more. So the question is, does wind affect evapotranspiration, and is climate change making it windier in places? And I'm assuming that's all in your model. And then Cheryl Knott asks, are local farm bureaus, ag agents, state water resources department employees, and or librarians involved in publicizing and educating about OpenET? How did the farmer in the video learn about OpenET and how to use it?
Just to speak to the first question first, yes, wind is a factor in ET. It kind of helps drive that gradient in vapor pressure deficit. It kind of moves the moisture from near the plants away from it, and so it maintains that deficit. And do you mind repeating that second question?
Yeah, and is climate change making it windier, just in general?
I can't speak to that off the top of my head. I'd have to do a little more digging.
Yeah, neither can I. I can't either.
And so the question is whether or not how the farmer in the video learned about OpenET, and are farm bureaus and ag agents and others involved in publicizing and educating people about the availability of OpenET.
Yeah, so it's like I've been part of the OpenET project for almost a year now, more formally, and so I can't speak to the farmer Mark Owens and how he got connected with the team, but the project's been ongoing for the last 7 years, and I know that there was a ton of outreach early on to farmers across the Western United States. We do work, it's like a lot of our validation efforts, especially here in the Salinas Valley, which is close to me in Monterey. We work through extension offices. And so, we definitely try to advertise, that OpenET data are available. We work with, the NRCS, and so it's been really neat recently to see some of the tools that the NRCS has developed on top of the OpenET data API. And so they've actually developed, Excel-based irrigation decision support tools. And so it's a nice plug to John Chilcote, who's the one that developed that effort. So, you can actually pull the API data into an Excel workbook, again, kind of showcasing the ability to transform, satellite-based data into something that people more commonly use on their own computer.
I think we're going to need to wrap it up. Just want to highlight Jessica Holofsky's comment about wind. Climate models aren't good at wind. For some reason, did that just disappear? I know there isn't consistency in future wind projections. I asked John, then Josh says I asked John Abatzoglu, who, by the way, was an undergrad at UC Irvine when I was there. No, grad student working for Gudrun Magnus' daughter. California, no support for increased wind speeds from John Abatzoglu. Excellent. We need to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it. The board really appreciates it. And Jill, I want to thank you for your leadership in reinvigorating this effort. Hopefully we can start to work on getting it to move to a full NASM study in which we'll reach back out to some of you folks. And I'm just going to turn it over to Jill. Thanks, everybody.
I just also want to thank everyone, especially Jay, for his organization of this with me. And thank you to all the speakers. It was just thought-provoking, and I expect a lot of future discussions to come out of it. And I do hope that that it results in an NASM study. And thank you also to Robin and the staff for all the organization of this. We just appreciate all the comments, all the questions. Thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.